So one of their surprising positions, I found it surprising at the time, was it became prohibited for journalists who worked for CanWest Global to criticize the government of Israel. You would be fired. People were sacrificially fired to get the word out that on that issue there would not be a range of opinions opposed. And eventually he sold it to the Aspers. And part of the CanWest Global initiatives, Izzy, the founder of the family, wanted to start a Canadian Holocaust Museum. He had a foundation that was sending students to Washington, the U.S. Holocaust Museum. Why not have a Holocaust Museum in Canada? So then hundreds of years, thousands of years. So the stock market seems to be doing pretty well. Is the stock market doing well because we're really in a recovery, or is it just reflecting the trillions of dollars of stimulus that the governments are charging against future generations to try to cover over what led to, for instance, the caving in of a huge investment bank, Lehman Brothers, at this time last year, the huge crisis on Wall Street. How did we get through it? Did we really come out of it through our smart adaptation, or is that stock market figure just reflecting the reality that if you're going to put trillions of dollars into the banks, into companies like General Motors, like Chrysler, if you're going to just come up with this, they had invented something called OPEC. Iraq had been a leading government in the invention of the oil, petroleum exporting countries, OPEC, and they organized a kind of embargo, and suddenly there was shortages of oil, and the price shot up 4 times. Now what we didn't get told publicly, and I think it's still not well known, in 1971 the US government went off the gold standard. So in theory, if you had a $20 bill, you could go up to the Treasury and say, now this is only a piece of paper here. It's just a piece of paper, but behind it is $20 worth of gold. So please give me the actual gold. But it'd be inconvenient to carry around all this gold in our pockets. So we'll allow this paper currency to represent gold. 1971, U.S. decided not to do that anymore. 1931, British Empire decided not to do that. So we're into an era of fiat currency. All that stands behind this paper is the reality that the government says, well, we will enforce. If it says it's worth $20, you can use it for $20, and if you run into some obstacle, we will enforce it. So trust us. So of course, currency, when it's paper, it works as long as people accept it as real. But if people start to question if it's stable, then it raises these serious issues. So this is what is going on with the price of gold. Now in 1973, a secret deal was made between Richard Nixon and the government of Saudi Arabia, which has the biggest reserve of oil in the world. After World War II, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was right there at the very end of the war. In a way, it was the great treasure for winning the war. The United States came out as the top combatant. It entered the war late. Of course, the United States wasn't affected by the battles, by the destruction. It hadn't been bombed. It hadn't had its industries mauled and its population killed. In fact, the United States had built up its industries very quickly. So the United States emerged from World War II. They had most of the world's gold supply. They had fantastic, innovative technology. They were faced with a world devastated. Look at Japan, dealing with occupation, dealing with the aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Look at Europe. I mean, it was, you could think of it as a civil war within Europe. Asia, parts of Asia had been devastated. So the United States sort of had all the cards and called the shots. And so the US dollar really continued to be the global currency. The US began to replace Britain as the main global economy around the time of the First World War. The First World War bankrupted Great Britain, although it continued to hold on to its empire. So as Britain was struggling, they abandoned the gold standard in 1931. US was struggling, but then with this partnership with the Saudis, who enforced it on other OPEC countries in ways I can't fully understand, but somehow the Saudis and Americans together, the US government and the Saudis, came up with a deal that essentially said you must buy your oil in US dollars. And so where the economy had been based, the global economy had been sort of stabilized or rooted to gold and silver up until then. After 1973, through the secret deal, you get into I call it the Saudi-US dollar. And it seems to me it's really at that point that the US starts to say, we're not going to worry about making cars and stereos and refrigerators. Let's allow countries where the labor rate is much less. We'll not do that, but it'll all go through our stock market. And essentially by that method, we will disempower labor unions. We can pay our workers much less money because they'll have to compete with people outside the country. And we can still have our US brands, but they'll be made in Philippines, in Indonesia, in China, and they'll be contracted out. And so we can have our US brands, and we'll essentially be transferring the wealth from the working people to the shareholders. And we can make money on that. And then you really see an added idea. Well, now we'll go into Eurasia. We'll get involved in pipelines. Is that interests want to get a monopoly. If you can have a monopoly, if you can have a cartel, if you can control the supply and demand in the market, then you can raise your prices. If you have real economy, then there's going to be less profit. So what happens in a competitive situation is the winner tends to prevail and then impose a kind of monopoly. And so really we have a system of kind of monopoly capitalism. The idea that this is all about competition is a bit. Anyway, Origi does the history of capitalism in different publications. I came across this reference to Picasso, and it's talking about the role of Genoese bankers, the Italian city-state Genoa. And Columbus himself was from Genoa.